There is a question worth sitting with as you settle in tonight. Not a loud question, not the kind that demands you sit up straight and pay attention. Just a quiet one that drifts in like fog and refuses to leave. Why do you want the things you want? Not the big philosophical version of that question. The small, ordinary version. Why do you reach for a particular brand without thinking? Why does a celebrity holding a product make you feel something about the product itself? Why does a crowd of people doing something make you feel like maybe you should be doing it too? Why does the word expert land differently than the word person? These aren't accidents. They aren't random quirks of human psychology that marketers stumbled onto by luck. They have a traceable origin, a specific moment in history when someone decided that human desire could be engineered, packaged, and delivered at scale. And that someone had a name, Edward Bernays. Most people have never heard of him. That's part of the point. The most powerful architects of modern life tend to work behind the curtain, and Bernays understood that better than almost anyone who ever lived. He wasn't a president or a general. He never ran a country or commanded an army. He was something quieter and, depending on how you look at it, something far more consequential. He was the man who figured out how to shape what millions of people believe, desire, and accept as normal without them ever knowing they were being shaped. He called it public relations. He built it into a profession. And in doing so, he changed the architecture of modern democratic life in ways we are still living inside of right now. Tonight, we're going to follow his story from the beginning. From a family shaped by exile and one of the most famous minds in the history of psychology, through wartime work that revealed to Bernays exactly how powerful organized persuasion could be, through the campaigns he ran and the methods he invented, through the books he wrote that laid out his philosophy with a candor that still manages to unsettle people when they encounter it for the first time, and through the long, complicated shadow he cast over politics, advertising, public opinion, and the quiet machinery of consent that runs beneath the surface of modern life. This is not a story about a villain. It is also not a story about a hero. It is a story about a man who looked at human beings and saw something that most people around him had not yet seen clearly. He saw that the crowd could be moved, that beneath the surface of rational decision-making, there were deeper currents. Emotional ones, tribal ones connected to fear and desire and the need to belong. And he saw that if you could speak to those currents in the right way, at the right moment, through the right voices, you could guide behavior in almost any direction you chose. The consent of the governed, that phrase so central to democratic ideals, Bernays spent his entire career quietly asking what it would mean if consent itself could be manufactured. It is a good question to bring with you into the dark. There is something almost restful about history told at a distance. The urgency fades. The noise quiets. What remains are the shapes of things, the patterns, the slow revelation of how one idea connected to another, how one man's work rippled outward through decades, and institutions and habits of mind until it became simply the water we swim in. That is what we are after tonight. Not outrage, not alarm, just understanding. The kind that comes when you finally see the mechanism behind something you have been living with your whole life without quite knowing it was there. Bernays was born in 1891. He died in 1995. He lived through more than a century of American and world history, and he did not merely observe that history. He helped engineer pieces of it, campaigns that changed how Americans ate breakfast, operations that toppled foreign governments, crusades that reshaped the social meaning of something as simple as a woman smoking a cigarette in public. Each of these things was deliberate. Each of them has his fingerprints on it. And each of them tells us something about the world we inherited. So get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. We're not in a hurry tonight. The past is patient. It has been waiting for us all this time, and it can wait a little longer while you find your rest. What we are exploring tonight is not just the biography of one unusual man. It is the quiet history of an idea, the idea that public opinion is not something that simply forms on its own like weather. It is something that can be cultivated, directed, constructed with intention and technique, the way you would build anything else. Edward Bernays believed that. He built a career on it, and the world he helped create is the one you are lying in right now, surrounded by desires and preferences and assumptions whose origins stretch back, quietly and directly, to him. Let's begin. Edward Bernays came into the world in Vienna in 1891, and Vienna in 1891 was not just a city. It was an idea, a civilization at its own peak, convinced of its permanence, built on centuries of empire and culture, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from being, for a very long time, the center of something enormous. The Habsburg Empire still held. The concert halls still rang. The coffee houses where intellectuals argued through the night were full. And beneath the surface of all that cultivated elegance, something new was stirring. Something that would crack the foundations of how Western civilization understood itself. Vienna in that era was producing, quietly and in parallel, several of the most consequential thinkers of the modern age. It was a city in ferment, even when it looked serene. And into that ferment, in the spring of 1891, a boy was born to a family that was already embedded in its most unusual intellectual circles. His father was Edward Bernays, a grain merchant. His mother was Anna Freud. Not the Anna Freud who would later become a significant psychoanalyst in her own right, though that is a different branch of the same remarkable family. This Anna was the sister of Sigmund Freud, which means that Edward Bernays, from the very moment of his birth, was the nephew of the man who would spend the next several decades constructing the most influential theory of the unconscious mind the world had ever seen. That connection is not incidental to the story of Edward Bernays. It is in many ways the story, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1892, when Edward was just a year old, the family made a decision that shaped everything that followed. They left Vienna. They packed up a life in one of the great cultural capitals of the world and sailed towards something uncertain and loud and relentlessly new. They came to New York City. They came to America. The reasons were practical, as reasons for emigration usually are when examined closely. The grain business had its logic. The family had connections. America was drawing people from across Europe, with the particular gravity of a place that promised reinvention. But the effect on a child growing up in that transplanted household was something more layered than simple practicality. The Bernays family carried Vienna with them. They carried its intellectual seriousness, its cultural ambitions, its faith in the power of ideas. And they set all of that down in the middle of a country that was raw and loud and expanding in every direction at once, and that had not yet quite decided what it believed about itself. That tension between old world sophistication and new world energy ran through the household Edward grew up in. It shaped the way he looked at the world before he had the language to explain what he was seeing. He was raised in a family that took ideas seriously and that also understood, at a very practical level, how commerce worked, how grain moved through markets, how people made decisions about buying and selling and trusting. The combination would turn out to be unusually potent. He grew up in New York, and New York at the turn of the 20th century was its own kind of overwhelming spectacle. Immigration was remaking the city block by block. Newspapers were multiplying. Department stores were transforming the experience of buying things into something theatrical and aspirational. The advertising industry was beginning to take shape, crude but energetic, still figuring out what it was. The city was in the business of manufacturing desire on a scale no previous civilization had attempted, and a boy with Bernays' particular inheritance was positioned to notice things about that process that others might walk past without registering. He was educated at Cornell, where he studied agriculture, which he would later describe as almost entirely irrelevant to everything he actually did with his life. What Cornell gave him was not a discipline but an exposure, a sense of how institutions worked, how knowledge was organized and credentialed, how the official world of expertise operated. He graduated in 1912 and began looking for what to do with himself. He found his way, almost by accident, into the world of publicity and press agentry, those half-formed predecessors to what he would later build into something far more deliberate and far more serious. But before all of that, there was the family, and in the family there was the uncle. Sigmund Freud was not a distant presence in the Bernays world. He was a real person, corresponding, visiting when circumstances allowed, a living connection to the intellectual revolution that was reshaping how educated people understood the human mind. Freud's central argument, put as simply as it can be put, was that human beings are not primarily rational creatures who occasionally act on emotion. They are primarily driven by unconscious forces, by desires and fears and drives that operate below the level of conscious awareness, and that the rational explanations people offer for their behavior are often stories constructed after the fact to make unconscious decisions feel reasonable. This was a deeply disturbing idea to many people. It still is. It suggests that the self you experience yourself to be, the deliberate reasoning person who makes choices based on evidence and values, is only part of the picture, and possibly not the most important part. For Bernays, growing up in proximity to this idea, absorbing it not as an academic abstraction but as a family inheritance, the implications were not primarily disturbing. They were illuminating. If people were driven by unconscious desires, if the rational surface of human decision-making was only the visible layer above something much deeper and more powerful, then understanding those deeper currents was understanding something real, something actionable. He would not arrive at the full implications of that insight immediately. That would come later, through specific experiences that crystallized what he had absorbed and showed him exactly how it could be applied. But the seed was there, planted in childhood, growing quietly alongside everything else. The immigrant household itself taught him something too, something that formal education rarely does. It taught him that identity is not fixed, that the self can be presented differently in different contexts, that how you appear to the world is something you have some control over, something that can be shaped with intention. His family had remade themselves, not entirely but significantly. They had taken a Viennese identity and grafted it onto an American life. They had learned the codes of a new culture while carrying the substance of an older one. That kind of double vision, seeing a culture from slightly outside it while also living inside it, turns out to be an enormously useful perspective if what you want to do is understand how that culture's members think and what moves them. Bernays was also watching the world around him with unusual attention. The early years of the 20th century were years of transformation in how information moved and how people formed opinions. Newspapers were mass media in a way nothing had been before. Advertising was becoming more sophisticated. The idea that large populations could be addressed simultaneously, that a message crafted in one place could land in millions of homes at once, was new enough to still be astonishing to people who thought carefully about it. And the city was full of people like him, ambitious, educated, cosmopolitan, shaped by old world cultures and hungry to make something new world and consequential of themselves. The immigrant experience gave many of them a kind of forward lean, an urgency about establishing themselves and their ideas that comes from having given up one life in exchange for the possibility of another. What Bernays was assembling in these early years was not yet a philosophy or a method. It was a set of raw materials, a family connection to the most revolutionary theory of the mind his era had produced, an upbringing that spanned two cultures and taught him to read both of them from a certain distance, an education in how institutions worked, a childhood spent in a city that was essentially a real-time experiment in manufacturing desire and manufacturing identity at enormous scale. He did not yet know what he was going to build with all of it, but the pieces were already there, waiting for the moment that would show him how they fit together. That moment, it turned out, would come from a war. From the specific and revelatory experience of watching organized persuasion work on millions of people simultaneously, of seeing consent manufactured on a scale even he had not previously imagined possible. But that is where we are going next. For now, it is enough to sit with the image of a young man carrying Vienna in his memory and New York in his eyes, nephew to Sigmund Freud, watching the world arrange itself around him, taking careful unconscious note of everything he saw. Before the war, there was theater. Bernays' first real professional home was the world of publicity, and in the early years of the 20th century, publicity was not yet a respectable trade. It was something between journalism and salesmanship, practiced by people called press agents, whose job was essentially to get newspapers to write about things the newspapers might not otherwise notice. Theater producers used them, circus owners used them, vaudeville promoters used them. The press agent's toolkit was simple and not particularly subtle. You cultivated relationships with reporters. You manufactured newsworthy moments. You planted stories. You created the impression that something worth paying attention to was happening. And if the thing itself was not naturally interesting, you added elements that were. Bernays was good at it. He had the social intelligence, the instinct for what would catch attention, the comfort in rooms full of journalists and performers and promoters that the work required. He promoted theatrical productions in New York, worked with performers, and learned the rhythms of a city that ran on spectacle and novelty. He understood intuitively that audiences do not simply discover what to pay attention to. Attention is directed, shaped. Someone is always somewhere making decisions about what rises to the surface of public awareness and what does not. But he also saw the limits of what persuasion was. It was reactive, improvised, personality dependent. It worked in the short term and for small purposes. It had no theory behind it, no framework that could explain why certain approaches worked and others did not, no method that could be systematically applied and reliably reproduced. The press agent was an artisan operating on instinct. What Bernays was beginning to sense, even in those early years, was that something more was possible. Something that looked less like promotion and more like architecture. Less like pushing a story at reporters, and more like shaping the environment in which people formed their opinions before any story was even written. He did not yet have the vocabulary for what he was imagining. That would come. But the dissatisfaction with simple press agentry was real, and it was productive. He was looking for something larger. The something larger arrived in 1917, when the United States entered the First World War. President Woodrow Wilson faced a problem that presidents going to war have always faced, and that this particular war made unusually acute. The American public was not enthusiastic. Many Americans saw the conflict as a European affair, a quarrel between dynasties and empires that had nothing to do with them. There was substantial immigrant populations who had complicated feelings about fighting their countries of origin. There was a strong tradition of isolationism, getting a large, diverse, skeptical democracy to support a war, to send its sons, to accept rationing and sacrifice and the enormous disruption that mobilization required, was not something that would happen automatically. Wilson's solution was to create the Committee on Public Information, almost immediately known as the Creel Committee after its chairman, the journalist George Creel. The committee's mandate was to sell the war to the American people, and it did so with an energy and scale and organizational sophistication that had no precedent in American history. It employed writers, artists, academics, filmmakers, and speakers. It produced pamphlets by the millions. It created the 4-Minute Men, volunteers who delivered short pro-war speeches in movie theaters across the country during the brief interval when reels were being changed. It understood instinctively and practically that winning a war required winning the public, and that winning the public required a coordinated, relentless, systematically organized campaign of persuasion. Bernays was part of this. He was young, well-connected, already known in New York media circles, and he brought his publicity skills to the effort. What he found inside the committee was something that went far beyond anything he had previously imagined. What he saw was that persuasion at mass scale was not qualitatively different from persuasion at small scale. It followed the same underlying logic. You identified what people already wanted, what they feared, what they loved, what they believed themselves to be. And then you showed them how the thing you wanted them to do connected to those existing drives. You did not argue people into new positions through the force of logic. You showed them that the positions you wanted them to hold were already consistent with who they understood themselves to be. You were not changing them. You were revealing something they already believed, already felt, already were. The committee did not tell Americans that supporting the war was a rational calculation that maximized certain strategic outcomes. It told them that supporting the war was what Americans do. What free people do, what patriots do, what people who love their families and their country and their way of life do. It wrapped the war in every existing American value it could locate and showed the war as the natural expression of those values. And it worked. The shift in public opinion was dramatic and relatively rapid. Bernays watched all of this with the kind of attention that a person pays to something that is confirming, on a vast and undeniable scale, what they had only previously suspected in smaller and less definitive ways. Here was proof, enormous and concrete, that public opinion was not something that simply happened. It was something that could be made, that mass sentiment, the thing that democratic theory treated as the authentic expression of what citizens genuinely thought and felt, could be shaped by the deliberate organized application of certain techniques. And the techniques were not fundamentally about lying. Though the committee did suppress information and inflate threats and simplify complexities into something more emotionally usable. The deeper technique was about understanding what already lived in people and connecting your message to it. It was about the emotional architecture of belief. It was about the difference between telling someone what to think and arranging conditions so that a particular thought felt inevitable and self-generated. This was where his uncle's ideas became not just intellectually interesting, but operationally relevant. If Freud was right, if people were moved primarily by unconscious drives and constructed rational justifications afterward, then the way to move people was not through the rational surface but through the emotional and symbolic depths. The Creel Committee had not succeeded by presenting Americans with comprehensive arguments for why the war served their interests. It had succeeded by attaching the war to things that already lived below argument, to love and fear and pride and identity, to the parts of the self that do not weigh evidence and calculate outcomes, but simply respond, immediately and powerfully, to certain images and symbols and stories. Wartime persuasion was, at its core, an experiment in applied psychology on a national scale. And the results of the experiment were unmistakable. When the war ended, Bernays came home with something he had not possessed before. He came home with a method, not yet fully articulated, not yet systematized into the books and theories he would later produce, but real and tested and backed by the experience of watching it work on millions of people simultaneously. He knew something now that very few people in the world of commerce and politics and public life had paused to understand: that the techniques developed to mobilize a nation for war could be turned to other purposes, that the machinery of mass persuasion was not inherently military, it was simply machinery, and it could be pointed at anything. The question was what to point it at next. He was 30 years old, recently returned from the most transformative professional experience of his life, and the peacetime world was waiting, full of products that needed selling and causes that needed supporting and opinions that needed forming. He had watched a democracy's consent be manufactured from whole cloth. Now he was going to find out what else could be built the same way. Bernays' first move after the war was not to run back to theater. It was to sit with what he had seen. The Committee on Public Information had not only proven that public opinion could be shifted, it had shown him that public opinion could be organized. That phrase sounds mild, almost bureaucratic. In his hands, it meant something closer to engineering. In a traditional civic story, public opinion is the sum of what millions of individuals think and feel after encountering facts, arguments, and experiences in the ordinary course of life. To Bernays, that account now seemed quaint. The war effort had demonstrated that if you coordinated messages, symbols, and trusted voices, if you repeated them across newspapers, posters, films, speeches, and casual conversation, if you made sure that at every turn the same emotional notes were being struck, then the seemingly spontaneous will of the public would line up with the pattern you had designed in advance. The public did not deliberate and then decide. It received, absorbed, and then discovered that it had decided. Bernays drew a simple but radical conclusion from this. In a modern society, with mass media and complex institutions, there would always be someone organizing the flow of ideas and feelings. The only real question was whether they knew what they were doing. He began to formalize this intuition into a theory. People, he believed, live inside fields of influence the way fish live in water. They do not see the currents that move them. They feel themselves swimming freely, choosing their own directions, unaware that the water itself has been set in motion by forces far away. In a democracy, those invisible currents mattered profoundly. Elections, consumer choices, public attitudes toward war and peace and reform, all of these rested on the stories people told themselves about the world and their place in it. If those stories could be planted, nourished, pruned, and directed, then democratic outcomes could be quietly steered without ever appearing to be coerced. He liked and later quoted approvingly a phrase that captured this idea with almost clinical bluntness: the manufacture of consent. The expression itself did not originate with him. Journalists and political thinkers had used similar words to describe how newspapers and parties shaped opinion. But Bernays made it into a principle. Consent, in his view, was not a raw material that citizens produced on their own. It was a finished product that could be manufactured by those who understood the psychology of the masses and controlled the mechanisms of communication. To say that consent could be manufactured was to say that agreement, support, enthusiasm, even outrage, could be designed. It did not have to wait on the slow work of argument and experience. It could be summoned, like a stage effect, by those who knew which buttons to press and in what sequence. This did not strike him as undemocratic. On the contrary, he argued that some form of organized guidance was inevitable and even necessary. Modern life was too complex, the flood of information too overwhelming, for ordinary people to investigate every issue from first principles. They relied on shortcuts, trusted authorities, familiar brands, recognizable symbols, the reassuring alignment of their own views with those of neighbors, clergy, editorial pages, and public figures. Someone, somewhere, would always be arranging those shortcuts. From his uncle, he had already taken the idea that the individual mind is not a perfectly lit room with a rational occupant at its center. It is a crowded, dimly illuminated space full of impulses, fears, desires, and half-remembered symbols. In groups, these hidden forces do not cancel out, they amplify one another. Crowds, as social psychologists in Europe had been arguing, are suggestible, emotional, prone to contagion. Bernays' insight was to connect this crowd psychology to the everyday operations of both governance and commerce. If you could understand how a crowd behaves, how it looks to leaders, how it looks to itself, what it wants to believe about its own motives, then you could design campaigns that would move that crowd without ever appearing to push it. In politics, that meant presenting policies as the natural extension of national character, or as the only reasonable response to a threat everyone had been primed to perceive. In business, it meant presenting products not as objects with features, but as answers to needs people barely knew they had, as badges of identity, as tokens in the dramas they lived out in private. He began to treat elections and sales campaigns as variations on the same problem. In each case, you were dealing with a mass of people whose conscious explanations for their choices would follow, not precede, the movement of deeper currents. In each case, the task of the persuader was to chart those currents and then drop the right objects into them at the right time. From this vantage point, the line between governing and selling blurred. A candidate could be sold like a soap. A soap could be endowed with the aura of patriotic duty. The techniques did not care what they were attached to. They only cared about results. Hovering over all of this was an ethical question that Bernays did not ignore, but that he resolved differently than many of his later critics. On one side was the idea of guidance. If the public inevitably moved along invisible lines of influence, then surely it was better that those lines be drawn by informed experts acting in what they believed to be the public interest, rather than by demagogues, rumor, or accident. In this frame, the manufacture of consent looked like a kind of social hygiene, a way to channel dangerous energies into constructive outlets, to prevent panic, to maintain order, to align private desires with public needs. On the other side was the reality of manipulation. To arrange conditions so that people freely choose what you have decided they should choose is to treat them less as citizens and more as instruments. Their autonomy becomes, at best, a managed illusion. They are allowed to say yes, but the field on which they say yes has been landscaped in advance. Bernays acknowledged that there was power here, and that power could be abused. But he tended to define abuse in terms of ends, not means. If the objective was sound public health, national security, economic stability, then the use of subtle psychological techniques seemed to him not only permissible but responsible. That those same techniques could be and would be used to sell trivial or harmful things or to justify questionable policies was a problem he noted more than he solved. What he held on to and what would drive the next phase of his career was the conviction that the new sciences of mind and crowd, combined with the new instruments of mass communication, had created a permanent condition. Societies like the United States would henceforth be guided by invisible hands, not the invisible hand of markets alone, but the invisible hand of organized persuasion. The public would continue to believe that it was making up its own mind. Bernays' project, increasingly explicit, was to become one of the people who arranged what those minds would find when they went looking for reasons. The lessons of wartime propaganda were not something he intended to leave on the battlefield. He would carry them into peacetime, into advertising and corporate strategy and political campaigns, convinced that the manufacture of consent was no temporary wartime expedient, but the central fact of modern democracy. To do that, he turned again to his uncle. Sigmund Freud had written about neuroses, repression, dreams, the long shadow of childhood. His case studies unfolded in quiet consulting rooms. His language was that of patients and symptoms, not voters and consumers. Edward Bernays read those works with a different question in mind. If the individual is not ruled primarily by reason, but by wishes, anxieties, and memories that operate out of sight, what does that mean for a society that claims to be rational? And if symbols in dreams can stand in for forbidden desires, might symbols in public life stand in for wishes that people cannot openly admit to themselves? The distance between the couch and the marketplace began to shrink. He was not a clinician. He did not practice analysis. But he recognized that the Freudian picture of the mind offered a toolkit for understanding the gaps between what people said and what they did. A person might say they wanted a car because of its fuel efficiency or reliability. Underneath, they might be seeking status, sexual attractiveness, a sense of power, or a feeling of escape. A person might insist on a certain brand of soap because it works better. Beneath that claim, there might be a craving for purity, a fear of contamination, a wish to feel like a good mother, a desire to belong to a class that used the right things. In Freud's case histories, these unconscious motives emerge slowly, through slips of the tongue, recurring images, associations between seemingly unrelated memories. Bernays' move was to assume that similar hidden patterns guided the choices of crowds, and that they could be reached more quickly, with less introspection, through careful design. Freud had shown that people can be defended against their own thoughts. Bernays suspected they were even more defended against the true sources of their preferences. This was the space he wanted to work in, the space between explanation and impulse. He began to talk and write about the engineering of consent in explicitly psychological terms. The word engineering was not idle. Just as an engineer studies stresses and loads before building a bridge, the persuader, he argued, must study the tensions and desires in a population before constructing a campaign. Facts and logical arguments still had their place, but he regarded them as surface elements, the visible superstructure. The real supports were emotional: fear and pride, vanity and guilt, the desire to be modern, the desire to be safe, the desire to be loved. In the 19th century, advertising had largely been a matter of listing features and shouting louder than competitors. Our product is cheaper, stronger, better. The rational consumer, presented with information, would supposedly choose the best option. Bernays treated that view of human nature as outdated. People did not simply weigh features, they sought meanings. They bought things to fill gaps in their identities, to match a picture they carried of themselves, or to keep up with a picture they imagined others had of them. What Freud called the ego and the superego, our sense of self and our internalized authorities, could be addressed in campaigns if you knew which images and words resonated with them. What he called the id, those pulses of appetite and aggression, could be given acceptable outlets. A cigarette could become, in the right framing, not just tobacco wrapped in paper, but a symbol of independence or sophistication. A car could be sold as liberation from constraint, a personal frontier. Soap could be associated with maternal care, with moral cleanliness, with the love of one's children. In this way, symbols became instruments. Bernays encouraged clients to think less about the physical object and more about the emotional currency it could carry. Colors, slogans, endorsements, the context in which a product appeared. All of these served as cues that linked an item to a web of feelings. He liked to say that people did not drink a brand of beer. They drank the feeling of companionship, of masculine camaraderie, of relaxation after work. They did not choose a brand of clothing. They chose an image of themselves, and sought confirmation of that image every time they caught their reflection or met someone's glance. Rational arguments could be mobilized in support of these feelings, but they rarely created them. They worked more like rationalizations, explanations the conscious mind offered after the fact. Why do I prefer this? Because it's better made. Because it's a good value. Because experts recommend it. Bernays' assumption was that those reasons followed the purchase. They did not lead it. The leading factors were subtler, whether the product fit into the drama of one's life, whether it harmonized with a desired role: good father, successful businessman, modern woman, patriotic citizen. This shift had consequences for practice. Advertising moved away from dense blocks of text and toward images that condensed complex desires into simple scenes. The happy family at breakfast, the confident executive with a particular pen, the glamorous couple stepping out of a particular car. Public relations campaigns emphasized events, gestures, endorsements, and rituals that could lodge in memory and stir feeling. In politics, the same logic applied. Voters, in this view, did not simply compare policy proposals. They gravitated toward candidates who embodied certain archetypes: the strong leader, the plain-spoken neighbor, the wise elder, the energetic reformer. Messages that attached a candidate to reassuring national symbols, or that tied an opponent to unsettling ones, often had more effect than detailed arguments. Bernays saw no sharp line between selling soap and selling policy. In both cases, he believed you were inviting people to adopt a story about themselves. This is the kind of person I am, and therefore this is the kind of choice I make. Freud had focused on how people misremembered and misinterpreted their personal histories. Bernays applied a similar lens to public life. Nations, too, lived by stories about their character. Companies had myths about their origins and missions. These collective narratives could be massaged, extended, or quietly redirected. If a company's past was bound up with smoke-belching factories, it might wish in the present to be associated with cleanliness, progress, health. The task for someone like Bernays was to build bridges in the mind between the old facts and the new image, using sponsorships, expert endorsements, charitable campaigns, and a flood of favorable coverage to rewrite what the brand evoked. Behind it all was a confidence that the unconscious is suggestible. Symbols repeated steadily in the right emotional key, safety, aspiration, belonging would, over time, become fused with the product or the politician in the public mind. Once that fusion occurred, the item or figure would carry that emotional charge automatically. You did not have to persuade, each time, that this soap meant purity or this candidate meant security. The association would operate silently like a reflex. Compared to the older ideal of rational public debate, this was a different vision of democracy and of the marketplace. Choices remained, but they were shaped by feelings that had been carefully cultivated. Bernays did not see this as trickery so much as alignment. You found the latent desires already present in a culture and gave them objects. You brought the language of Freud's consulting room, the language of wishes, fears, and symbols, into the bustling world of sales and policy. By the end of the 1920s, that fusion had begun to change not just individual campaigns, but the entire atmosphere of advertising and public relations. Goods no longer appeared as mere utilities. They appeared as extensions of the self, props in an inner drama that few consumers would ever pause to analyze. In that environment, the person who understood unconscious desire held an advantage. Bernays intended to be that person, a quiet interpreter of hidden motives, translating Freud's dark insights into bright, persuasive messages for a mass audience. Bernays did not want to be seen as merely clever with slogans. From early on, he insisted that what he did was not just advertising. It was something broader, more strategic, almost constitutional in its ambition. He began to call it public relations. Advertising in his description was about selling a specific product or service, usually in a straightforward paid-for space. You bought an ad in a newspaper, a page in a magazine, a segment on the radio. You shouted in some form, "Here we are. Buy this." Public relations, he argued, was different in both scope and method. It concerned the entire environment in which opinion formed. It reached beyond the page bought for a slogan and into the news columns, the lecture halls, the professional associations, the charities, the dinner tables. It was, in his words, the engineering of consent, as an ongoing function, not a series of isolated pitches. To make that claim credible, he had to define himself not as a huckster, but as a counselor. He borrowed language from law and medicine. Just as a corporation might retain a lawyer to interpret the legal landscape, or a doctor to safeguard physical health, it should retain a public relations counsel to interpret the landscape of opinion and safeguard its reputation. The client, in this framing, was often clumsy and impulsive in its dealings with the public. A company might see only sales figures and costs. A government agency might see only regulations and mandates. Bernays presented himself as the person who could see the invisible side, the moods, fears, resentments, and aspirations in which any message would land. He liked the metaphor of the interpreter. Between a specialized institution and the general public, there was a gap in language. The engineer spoke in technical terms, the banker in financial jargon, the politician in insider shorthand. The public relations council would translate, not only linguistically but emotionally, finding words, events, and symbols that made the client's purposes seem natural, reasonable, even inevitable. That meant in practice, his work often began long before any advertisement appeared. He would study the client's situation, who opposed them, who supported them, which newspapers mattered in which cities, which professional groups had prestige, which charities were admired. He would map the web of influence for a particular issue. From that map, he would identify what he called third parties. These were figures and institutions that already possessed the trust he wanted attached to his client's cause. Doctors, university professors, clergy, women's clubs, civic leagues, trade associations, scientific foundations, government commissions, editorial boards. They were, in his system, the carriers of legitimacy. The direct voice of a company praising its own product, he regarded as weak. Of course, a manufacturer said its goods were safe or efficient or wholesome. The public discounted such claims as self-interested. But if a respected medical society endorsed the same product, or if a university released a study with favorable findings, or if a charitable organization partnered with the company on some public-facing campaign, the message changed. The praise appeared to come from outside, from seemingly disinterested expertise. Bernays worked to orchestrate those voices. He would suggest research topics to academics, sometimes with funding from his clients. He would encourage trade groups to convene conferences in which his client's perspective could be presented as part of a broader discussion. He would organize committees of concerned citizens or national experts, whose statements could then be quoted in newspapers. In this way, persuasion was routed through intermediaries. He also understood that nothing focused attention like an event. Rather than simply sending out a press release, he preferred to create something that journalists would feel compelled to cover on its own terms. A breakfast with notable guests, a public ceremony, a first of some kind, an exhibit, a contest, a conference. The event would have its own logic and story, but behind it lay a calculated message. He would plan these occasions with an eye to narrative. What headline did he want to see the next day? What quotes did he want in the first paragraphs? Which photographs would newspapers be likely to run? And how could the scene be staged so that those images naturally aligned with the desired theme? Reporters overworked and under deadline were offered ready-made material, background notes, suggested angles, pre-written statements. The news story practically wrote itself, and in writing itself, carried his client's preferred framing into millions of homes. The key was to avoid the appearance of coordination. A campaign, in Bernays' ideal, did not look like a campaign. It looked like a convergence of independent developments, experts speaking, organizations acting, citizens gathering, newspapers reporting, products selling. The public saw a pattern and drew conclusions, unaware that many of the threads had been laid down by a single hand. To maintain this illusion, he stressed subtlety. Public relations, he wrote, must avoid untruths as it would the plague, not because he was especially devoted to transparency, but because outright lies, once exposed, destroyed the very trust on which his method depended. Better to select, emphasize, and connect true facts in such a way that they pointed reliably to the desired conclusion. A manufacturer, for example, might genuinely support a public health initiative. Bernays would amplify that support, ensure that respected physicians spoke about it, arrange for schools or charities to participate, and then see to it that the resulting coalition was described as a spontaneous movement of concerned professionals, rather than as a campaign sparked by a firm with a commercial interest. He wrote books to codify these practices, crystallizing public opinion in the 1920s, followed by propaganda in the 1920s and 30s. In them, he set out not only to defend what he did, but to systematize it. The work, as he described it, followed a sequence. First, research. Learn the attitudes of the group you wish to influence, not just through intuition, but through surveys, interviews, observation. Second, strategy. Decide what you wanted those attitudes to become, and what symbols and associations could move them. Third, tactics. Design events, statements, alliances, and themes that embodied that strategy. Fourth, feedback. Watch how the public responded and adjust. This was how persuasion became, in his hands, a profession rather than a collection of tricks. He wanted clients to see that you could not simply buy a few advertisements and hope. You had to treat opinion itself as a kind of terrain, charted and recharted, with peaks of enthusiasm, valleys of distrust, and fault lines of controversy. The Professional Public Relations Counsel was the surveyor and engineer of that terrain. Over time, his way of speaking about the work spread. Companies began to create public relations departments rather than just advertising offices. Nonprofits hired communication directors. Governments employed information services and press secretaries who thought in terms of relationships, narratives, and long-term positioning. The word propaganda, stained by war and dictatorship, faded in polite usage. The phrase public relations took its place, smoother, more neutral. But the underlying idea remained the same, that in a complex society, the shaping of perception was too important to be left to accident. Bernays had given that idea a vocabulary, a set of tools, and a sense of professional identity. In his view, this was a necessary adaptation. Without expert counsel, he argued, institutions would blunder, the public would be misinformed, and democracy would dissolve into chaos. With it, he believed, the irrational tendencies Freud had described could be steered in constructive directions. Whether that faith was justified, and what it meant for citizens who never agreed to be engineered, would become clearer as his campaigns moved from products to politics, from breakfast tables to the public square. Bernays liked to say that people do not argue much about breakfast. They simply eat what they are accustomed to eating. The first meal of the day felt like the opposite of politics or controversy. It was private, routine, almost beneath notice that, for him, made it fertile ground. In the 1920s, most Americans did not wake up to what we now think of as the classic American breakfast. Many had coffee and a roll, fruit, maybe cereal. The idea that a real breakfast meant bacon and eggs every morning was not a timeless tradition. It was, in significant part, a campaign. One of his clients was the Beech Nut Packing Company, which sold, among other things, bacon. They wanted to sell more of it, but bacon is not like a new gadget or a fashion accessory. You do not buy 5 of them at once. You eat it, if you eat it habitually. The real question, Bernays realized, was not how to convince someone to try bacon once. It was how to make bacon part of what they believed a normal, proper, even healthy breakfast should be. So he did not start with recipes or slogans. He started with a question: what do Americans believe about health in the morning? At the time, there was a widespread interest in scientific nutrition, but also a lingering memory of hearty farm breakfasts as a symbol of strength. Bernays looked for a way to connect those two currents. If he could persuade people that a hearty breakfast was scientifically superior, and then define hearty in a way that included bacon and eggs, the habit might follow almost automatically. He turned to one of his favorite instruments, the authority of the doctor. Working through the company's physician, he asked, was a light breakfast truly ideal? Or might a larger, protein-rich meal be better for the average American, especially those going out to a day of work? The doctor, unsurprisingly, agreed that a more substantial breakfast could be recommended. Bernays then asked him to put that opinion in writing, addressed to other physicians. The letter invited them to consider whether their patients might be healthier with a heartier start to the day, including foods like bacon and eggs. This was not framed as advertising. It was framed as a medical inquiry, a professional consideration. Many doctors responded affirmatively. They signed statements saying, in essence, that a substantial breakfast was beneficial. Bernays now had what he wanted, not a claim from a meat packing company, but a set of statements from hundreds of physicians. He distilled these responses into a conclusion. A large majority of doctors recommended a hearty breakfast. That phrase, a large majority of doctors, was the key. It was vague enough to sound impressive, specific enough to be quotable, and grounded in real replies, even if the question had been constructed with care. He then released this finding to newspapers and magazines. The stories that followed did not look like advertisements. They appeared as health news, as expert advice, Headlines explained that doctors endorsed a more substantial breakfast, often including examples like bacon and eggs. Articles described the supposed benefits: more energy, better stamina, less mid-morning fatigue. Beechnut's product slipped into the narrative as the logical choice for those who wished to follow the doctor's guidance. After all, if experts agreed that a hearty, protein-rich breakfast was wise, and if bacon and eggs fit that description, then having bacon and eggs in the morning sounded like common sense. This was the structure he loved. First, a generalized principle, blessed by authority. Second, the quiet insertion of the client's product as the natural way to live by that principle. The brilliance, from his point of view, was that he had not argued, "Buy beechnut bacon because beechnut says it is good." He had helped create a feeling. A proper American starts the day with a nourishing, cooked breakfast. Once that felt true, the sale of bacon was almost a byproduct of the larger belief. Habit, he understood, was more valuable than any single purchase. If you convince someone to buy one bar of soap, you have a brief gain. If you help shape the belief that cleanliness requires a daily shower with a particular kind of soap, you have a long-term customer. If a city drinks your brand of coffee once, that is pleasant. If people decide that their morning is incomplete without a cup of coffee, the market transforms. In his writings, he was explicit about this. The Public Relations Council should aim, where possible, not merely to promote a product, but to weave it into everyday life as a standard practice, something people do without feeling they're responding to a campaign. Breakfast was an ideal laboratory for this approach. By invoking doctors, he tapped into what psychologists later called the authority heuristic. When an expert speaks, people feel safer adopting the recommendation. By having many doctors, he tapped into another tendency, the comfort of majority opinion. If most doctors say something, the risk of being wrong feels lower. Then came repetition. The message about the hearty breakfast did not appear in one isolated article and vanish. It was repeated through multiple outlets, echoed in women's magazines, cookbooks, radio programs, and pamphlets. The phrasing stayed consistent: doctors recommend, hearty breakfast, bacon and eggs. The words themselves became familiar. Repetition in his method did not mean crude hammering. It meant gentle, steady reinforcement across different contexts, always framed as information rather than as a demand. A housewife might read a health column citing physicians, hear a radio host mention a good bacon and eggs breakfast, and see a recipe in a magazine that fit the same pattern. None of these, on their own, felt like pressure. Together, they formed a landscape in which one particular breakfast began to look like the obvious choice. This was how Bernays attached products to routine and common sense. He often argued that the most effective persuasion works not by winning an argument, but by making an alternative invisible. If the story of a proper morning is always told with certain foods in it, then choosing differently begins to feel strange, even irresponsible. The bacon and eggs campaign also revealed something else: how easily the appearance of science can be bent toward commercial ends. There was no rigorous, randomized study comparing breakfast types. There was a carefully worded letter and a self-selected group of physicians who, when asked in a certain way, gave the confirmation he needed. The resulting statistic, "so many doctors recommend," carried the weight of medical authority without the substance of controlled research. Yet to the public, that nuance was invisible. They saw only the headline. For Bernays, this was not a flaw. It was the essence of his craft. He had identified a desire for health, for strength, attached it to a respected authority, and then aligned his client's interest with the resulting standard. From that point forward, every sizzle of bacon in a pan each morning was not just a sale. It was the echo of a campaign that had quietly redefined what breakfast should be. And in his mind, if such redefinition could be accomplished over something as simple as a morning meal, there was very little in modern life that could not, under the right conditions, be shaped in a similar way. If breakfast had shown him how to slip a product into the calm routines of daily life, cigarettes offered him something more volatile, a chance to attach a product to a moral struggle. In the 1920s, tobacco companies wanted half the population they did not yet fully have. Men smoked almost everywhere, in offices, clubs, on the street. Cigarettes were symbols of sophistication, modernity, even rebellion, but primarily for men. For women, the rules were different. In most respectable settings, a woman lighting a cigarette in public risked being seen as vulgar, loose, unladylike. Smoking was linked to vice, to cabarets, to sex work, to the demi-monde. Many restaurants and hotels banned women from smoking in public areas. Even where it was not explicitly forbidden, it was understood as improper. The taboo was not simply about tobacco, it was about control. A woman who smoked in public signaled that she was not bound by certain expectations of decorum and submission. If she could decide for herself when to light a cigarette, what else might she decide? To a cigarette company, this was not a moral question. It was a locked market. American Tobacco, maker of Lucky Strike, wanted that lock opened. They hired Bernays. The task was simple to state and difficult to accomplish. Make it acceptable, even fashionable, for women to smoke in public. Bernays did not begin with nicotine or flavor, he began with symbols. He studied the way cigarettes were already talked about. For some women, smoking in private was a quiet act of defiance. For some suffragists and younger women, it already had an aura of independence. The language of liberation was in the air. Women had recently won the right to vote. There were debates about work, dress, sexual freedom. He looked for the point where a cigarette could be recast not as a vice, but as a badge. He consulted with a psychoanalyst, as he often did. Together, they spoke about cigarettes as objects of power, especially in a culture where men dominated public space. The idea emerged that for some women, a cigarette could represent a kind of symbolic male privilege, a torch of independence. From there, he conceived one of his most famous stunts. He chose the New York City Easter Parade as his stage. The parade was a public ritual of respectability. Churchgoers, families, fashionable men and women walking along Fifth Avenue in their best clothes, watched by crowds and photographed by newspapers. In that environment, the sight of women suddenly smoking would carry shock. He quietly recruited a group of young, socially prominent women, many from good families, some involved in progressive causes. He did not present the plan to them as an advertising trick. He framed it as a dramatic gesture for women's rights. He suggested that, at a coordinated moment during the parade, they should light cigarettes and march, holding them up openly. Not as a private indulgence, but as public torches of freedom, he advised them on the language. If asked, they were to speak not about brands, but about freedom, equality, the right to do as men did without shame. He then alerted the press. He contacted photographers and newspaper reporters in advance, hinting that something unusual might occur. A group of young women would commit an act of symbolic rebellion, lighting what he called torches of freedom to protest against the social taboo on women smoking. He made sure the phrase would be ready to print. On Easter Sunday, as the parade moved down Fifth Avenue, the women did what they had rehearsed. At a signal, they pulled out their cigarettes, lit them, and walked on, visible, unhidden. People noticed, so did the cameras. The next day, newspapers carried photographs of fashionable women smoking in the Easter parade. The articles quoted the phrase "torches of freedom," repeating Bernays' framing almost word for word. The stunt was reported not as a commercial promotion, but as a small feminist uprising. The symbolism did the work. By linking a cigarette to the language of liberation, the gesture blurred the line between a political protest and a marketing event. A product once tied to male privilege and female scandal was now wrapped, however loosely, in the fabric of women's rights. Bernays had redirected the force of a genuine social movement toward a commercial end. He did not invent the desire for freedom. He noticed it, named it, and then attached his client's product to it. The taboo on women smoking was recast as an infringement on liberty, a relic of patriarchal control. Lighting a cigarette in public could now be experienced, as he intended, as a small act of emancipation. For many women, this resonance was real. To claim the right to smoke if one wished could feel like claiming the right to occupy public space on equal terms. The cigarette became one more element in a broader loosening of Victorian norms, alongside shorter skirts, bobbed hair, and wages earned outside the home. Sales followed. As newspapers and magazines echoed the torches of freedom story, images of women smoking began to appear more often in advertisements and popular culture, presented as modern, confident, independent. The stigma did not disappear overnight, especially in more conservative circles, but it weakened. What had once been a marker of transgression now, in some settings, signaled sophistication. The campaign's effectiveness lay in its double meaning. On the surface, it looked like a political gesture. In practice, it was a carefully orchestrated publicity event for a tobacco company. The press, believing they were covering a spontaneous protest, amplified a corporate strategy. Bernays later recounted the episode with pride. For him, it proved that public relations could do more than sell an object. It could reshape customs, reframe norms, and move lines that had once seemed firmly drawn. He called it an example of how an old taboo could be broken with the right psychological insight and media handling. It also revealed the darker potential of his method. If you can attach cigarettes to women's liberation, you can attach almost anything to almost any cause, provided this symbol is vivid enough and the press is willing to play along. The boundary between authentic social progress and manufactured consent becomes hard to see. In retrospect, the Torches of Freedom campaign feels particularly unsettling because of what we now know about smoking. The liberation it promised came at a cost measured in disease and death. The women who claimed their right to smoke were exercising autonomy, but they were also entering a market that had quietly studied their desires and fears and turned those into instruments of profit. This is part of why the episode has become one of the most cited and most troubling examples of Bernays' work. It shows in concentrated form his core technique: take a deep emotional current, in this case, the wish for equality, translate it into a symbol, stage an event around that symbol, and allow the media and the public to complete the story. There was no overt advertisement, no shouted command to buy a particular brand. There was a narrative: women demanding freedom, expressed through a cigarette held high. Once that narrative circulated, the products did not need to argue for themselves. They simply waited at the tobacconist's counter. To him, that was the triumph of his craft. To later critics, it was a warning: ideals could be harnessed to sell addictions, and public opinion could be guided not only on trivial matters of taste, but on questions that touch the body, the self, and the meaning of freedom itself. The torches he helped light that Easter did not only burn tobacco. They illuminated how easily the language of liberation could be bent, quietly, toward the service of commerce. The Easter parade showed him one thing clearly: if you could turn a cigarette into a symbol of freedom using a handful of debutantes and a few newspaper photographers, you could do the same with almost anything, using almost anyone. From there, Bernays became even more deliberate about another resource he had already begun to use: people with prestige. He understood that most of us do not make up our minds in a vacuum. We watch what certain figures do, people we trust, admire, or simply recognize, and we take our cues from them. Sometimes we copy them consciously. More often, we absorb their choices as if they were simply part of the atmosphere. Bernays called this the influence of opinion leaders. They came in many forms: movie stars and athletes, of course, but also doctors, professors, religious figures, heads of clubs and associations, society hostesses, union leaders, magazine editors. Anyone who could stand, in the public mind, for a larger group. He rarely put a company executive in front of the camera. He knew the public expected a salesman to sell. Instead, he looked for people who appeared independent of the product, but whose authority could cover it. If he was promoting a food, he did not talk first about taste. He reached for nutrition experts, dietitians, physicians, heads of hospital departments. Their statements could be quoted in ads, but they would look like medical advice, not sales copy. If he wanted to normalize a product in upper-class circles, he did not start with price or quality. He worked with society figures, well-known hostesses, charity leaders, people whose names appeared regularly in the social pages. When they adopted a product at their dinners or events, it quietly signaled that this was the standard of good taste. He cultivated these people with care. He organized luncheons where experts could meet one another, receive briefings, and be introduced without ever feeling as if they were being hired. He sent them reports, data, and books, sometimes ghostwritten by his own staff, that aligned with his clients' interests. If they later expressed those views in interviews or speeches, they often believed they were speaking entirely for themselves. This was one of his subtle tricks: make it possible for others to adopt your client's position as if it were their own reasoned conclusion. The endorsement might never bear the name of the company. A radio program would invite a doctor to discuss modern nutrition, or a columnist would write about the importance of sanitation or mental health or fashion. Inside those broad topics, Bernays arranged for his client's product, brand, or policy to be present, just one element in a reasonable, expert-guided discussion. To the audience, it looked like expertise. To Bernays, it was a carefully charted channel. He did not stop at individuals. He extended this logic to organizations. He encouraged trade associations to issue statements. He urged professional societies to adopt resolutions. He helped form committees with names that sounded impartial, councils for this or that, founded, funded, or quietly influenced by his clients. The more independent the source appeared, the more powerful the message. Around these spokespeople and groups, he built what later scholars would call pseudo-events. A pseudo-event, as he practiced it, was not pure fiction. It was a real occurrence, but one created primarily to be reported, rather than to meet an existing need. It was scheduled, staged, and designed so that journalists could not resist it. He would arrange for a conference of experts on a timely topic, making sure his clients' preferred conclusions were well represented. He might set up a public ceremony, an opening, a proclamation, a prize, where a product, an idea, or a policy could be associated with progress or prestige. The structure was simple. First, invent an occasion that looks newsworthy. A breakfast meeting of surgeons to discuss modern hygiene. A fashion show dedicated to the color of the season. A forum on traffic safety, civic planning, or national health. Second, make sure the right experts, celebrities, or social leaders are present. Their attendance validates the event. Their remarks can be quoted. Their images can appear alongside the themes Bernays wants to push. Third, invite the press. Reporters are always in need of stories, especially ones that come prepackaged with quotes, photos, and clear angles. Bernays understood the pressures of newsrooms. By handing journalists an event with an obvious headline and recognizable faces, he made it easy for them to fill their pages. He was not simply buying ads. He was writing the raw material of tomorrow's news. Once the story appeared, the lines blurred. Was the public reading an impartial account of something inherently important, or a piece of theater arranged around a client's interest? More often than not, they could not tell. Frequently, the journalists themselves did not fully know how orchestrated the event had been. Radio and later television amplified this method. On radio, experts' voices carried an air of intimacy and trust. A doctor giving health advice, a professor discussing social trends, a film star interviewed about modern living, all could casually mention certain habits, products, or attitudes that align neatly with a campaign. Television added faces and settings, a talk show appearance, a news segment, or a special program about some contemporary issue could display objects in the background, showcase particular lifestyles, and feature individuals who had been quietly briefed by Bernays or his colleagues. Viewers saw a familiar actor cooking with a certain oil, a trusted host praising a certain policy, a panel of ordinary citizens expressing opinions that had been softly guided behind the scenes. None of this felt like an advertisement because it did not announce itself as one. Bernays' genius and his danger lay in this quiet embedding. He helped build a world in which influence wrapped itself in the clothing of normal life. A news story, a recommendation from your doctor, a cause embraced by a star, a conference report, a charity gala. To him, this was a rational way to coordinate public opinion in a complex society. People needed trusted guides. He simply supplied them with messages. To later observers, it looked increasingly like a rehearsal for the media environment we live in now. Today, celebrities post about products and causes on social media, blurring the line between sincerity and sponsorship. Experts appear on cable news panels, sometimes funded by the industries they discuss. Influencers present their lives as content, with brands woven into every scene. Online events, hashtag campaigns, viral challenges, staged controversies are carefully seeded to catch the attention of journalists and users alike. The machinery Bernays assembled with telegrams, typewriters, and press clippings has been updated, networked, and accelerated, but the underlying logic remains familiar. Find the figures people trust, give them a script, or simply a nudge. Create occasions that will be covered as news. Let mass media and now algorithms do the rest. The surface looks spontaneous. The reality is often, at least in part, staged. As we turn from his work with celebrities and experts to his direct involvement in politics, that distinction between appearance and reality will become even more important. Because for Bernays, shaping tastes and habits was only one arena. The same techniques could be applied to elections, policies, and the fate of nations. When Bernays turned his attention from soap and cigarettes to presidents and public policy, he did not feel as if he were changing professions. In his mind, it was the same task in a different setting. You still had a client, you still had a public, you still had a gap between what the client wanted and what the public currently believed, and you still had the same toolbox: symbols, experts, events, and the steady drip of stories. The stakes, however, became much larger. Instead of asking whether people would eat bacon for breakfast, he was now helping to answer who would govern them, what wars they would support, and which ideas would seem natural in a democracy. Bernays did not think this was a contradiction. He thought it was a necessity. He believed that modern societies were simply too large and too complex to function on the basis of millions of separate, fully informed individual decisions. No one, he argued, could possibly study every issue in detail. No one had the time to read every bill, examine every candidate's record, or investigate every foreign policy choice. In such a world, someone would inevitably step in to organize attention and guide opinion. For him, this was not the collapse of democracy, it was its secret machinery. He wrote that, in a democratic society, there existed an invisible government made up of those who understood how to shape public opinion. They were not always elected, and they did not always appear in public. They were advisors, communicators, and specialists in persuasion. He counted himself among them. To Bernays, this was not something to be ashamed of. It was, he thought, simply how things worked. Democracy, in his view, was not the direct expression of raw public will. It was a system in which leaders, using public relations, translated their goals into terms acceptable to the public, and in which citizens responded to symbols, stories, and trusted figures. If you could manage those symbols responsibly, he believed, you could guide a nation towards what its leaders judged to be the public good. Critics heard something far more troubling in this. They looked at the same description and saw a narrowing of real choice. If the field of available opinions had already been curated, if the issues were framed, the options pre-selected, the emotional tone arranged, then what exactly were citizens choosing between? Was it true debate, or a series of staged alternatives? In elections, Bernays' methods appeared in familiar ways. Candidates were no longer just men with programs. They became personalities with carefully constructed images. Their biographies were shaped into narratives: the humble beginnings, the war record, the business success, the devotion to family. Their speeches were tailored not only to present policies, but to evoke feelings: reassurance, hope, firmness, optimism. Opinion leaders did their part. Newspaper columnists, clergy, local businessmen, and union heads were quietly briefed. They were given talking points, invited to exclusive luncheons, provided with data that favored one side. Letters to the editor were encouraged, community meetings were suggested, endorsements were orchestrated so that support appeared to bubble up from below. Behind the scenes, polls and focus groups became tools for measuring which phrases worked, which themes resonated, which fears and hopes responded most readily to certain messages. The public heard debates and campaign speeches. Bernays heard the tuning of an instrument. Policy campaigns followed a similar pattern, but stretched over longer arcs. If a corporation or government agency wanted support for a new law, a regulatory change, or a major project, he did not start by explaining the technical details. He began with values. Was this change about security, progress, health, freedom? He would select the word that linked the policy to a deep, shared concern. Then he would build a frame around it. Out would come the experts: professors, doctors, economists, engineers. They would speak at conferences, write articles, appear in interviews. Their language would echo the chosen frame. A dam would be a monument to progress. A treaty would be a guarantee of peace. A tax policy would be a reward for initiative. Civic groups would be encouraged to take positions: women's clubs, business associations, veterans groups, church councils. Some would receive background materials, some would be helped to draft resolutions. Some would find, without quite knowing how, that their agendas now included a discussion of the very issue Bernays' client wished to advance. By the time a bill came up for a vote, it would appear to stand at the center of a spontaneous national conversation. Public-spirited campaigns on health, safety, or civic behavior followed yet another variation. When he worked on causes like safe driving, disease prevention, or wartime bond sales, Bernays liked to present persuasion as a purely positive force. He spoke of educating the public. He used the language of uplift and enlightenment. Posters, radio spots, school programs, and community events were orchestrated to align private behavior with a larger social goal. In these efforts, the boundary between leadership and manipulation became tricky. On the one hand, many of the causes were arguably beneficial. Fewer accidents, better hygiene, more investment in public goods, these were real gains. On the other hand, the techniques were identical to those used to sell products or to push policies that primarily benefited powerful interests. If the method is the same, critics asked, what stops a public relations counselor from using it to sell war as easily as he sells safety? Bernays tried to answer this by insisting on a moral dimension. He wrote that public relations should be guided by an understanding of the public interest. Practitioners, he suggested, had a duty to harmonize the desires of clients with the needs of society. They were to be engineers of consent, but consent, in his phrasing, implied some level of awareness and agreement. His harshest opponents did not agree that this line could be maintained. They argued that genuine consent requires not only agreement, but also the opportunity to refuse, to question the framing itself, and to hear arguments that have not already been filtered by professionals. If every major campaign, on every major issue, arrives already wrapped in a carefully tested narrative, then where exactly does the public get a chance to see the unvarnished picture? The question grows larger. Can a public be led without being manipulated? Bernays would have said yes. He would claim that as long as facts were not falsified, as long as people were informed in some fashion and had the technical power to vote differently, persuasion remained legitimate. He would argue that it was simply more efficient to present those facts through symbols and stories that people could absorb. His critics would say that the very selection of which facts to highlight, which feelings to evoke, and which alternatives to ignore already tilts the field. In quiet moments, the distinction thins. A poster urging you to wash your hands and a poster urging you to support a foreign intervention may use the same colors, the same appeals to duty, the same images of vulnerable children. One touches hygiene, the other touches geopolitics, but both treat you as a mind to be guided, not a partner in a shared inquiry. As we move from this general discussion of politics and persuasion to a specific episode in Bernays' career, these tensions become more than theoretical. In the case of a certain fruit company and a small Central American nation, we can watch his ideas about democracy, leadership, and public opinion unfold in real time, and see what happens when the engineering of consent moves from the marketplace into the fate of a country. The client, in this case, was not a toothpaste brand or a civic committee. It was the United Fruit Company. By the middle of the 20th century, United Fruit was not just a business. It was an empire stitched together with banana plantations, railroads, ports, and political connections stretching from Boston boardrooms to Central American fields. In Guatemala, its presence was especially deep. The company owned vast tracts of land, much of it left idle as reserve, controlled major rail lines, and influenced government decisions. It enjoyed tax exemptions and favorable contracts. For decades, conservative regimes had protected these arrangements. Then the politics shifted. In 1944, a popular uprising toppled a military dictatorship and opened a period of reform. A series of elected governments tried to modernize the country, expanding education, improving labor laws, and eventually confronting the question of land. By the early 1950s, President Jacobo Arbenz, a former military officer with reformist leanings, introduced Decree 900, an agrarian reform law. Unused land on large estates could be expropriated by the state with compensation and redistributed to landless peasants. On paper, it was a domestic policy aimed at alleviating rural poverty and breaking semi-feudal patterns. In practice, it collided directly with United Fruit's interests. The company held hundreds of thousands of acres in Guatemala, much of it uncultivated. Under the new law, the government moved to take a portion of this fallow land and offered compensation based on the low values United Fruit itself had declared for tax purposes. What, for the Guatemalan government, was a question of social justice and modernization, appeared to United Fruit as a threat to its business model. And, in the early Cold War climate, business trouble could be framed as something else. This is where Bernays entered. United Fruit hired him in the late 1940s to help manage its public image. Officially, he was to improve relations with the American public, policymakers, and the press. Unofficially, his task blurred into something larger, helping to cast Guatemala's domestic reforms as part of a global ideological struggle. At the time, the United States government was increasingly anxious about communism. The Soviet Union had consolidated control in Eastern Europe. China had undergone revolution. The Korean War had erupted. In Washington, the language of containment and domino theories took hold. Any reformist movement, anywhere, could be read as the first step towards a communist takeover. United Fruit and its counselors understood this atmosphere. If the conflict in Guatemala could be placed within the anti-communist frame, it would be easier to win sympathy in Congress, the State Department, and the press. Bernays did not invent this logic, but he helped give it shape. He began by working on the raw material of perception, information. He arranged for American journalists, editors, and opinion leaders to visit Central America on company-sponsored trips. These were not framed as propaganda tours, they were presented as opportunities to see the region, to understand its politics, to report on development. The itineraries, however, were carefully curated. Visitors met with business-friendly officials, company executives, and selected locals. They heard about the dangers of radicalism, the instability that could follow land seizures, the alleged infiltration of communist ideas into Guatemalan unions and parties. They did not necessarily meet in equal measure, the peasants seeking land or the reformers arguing for constitutional change. Back in the United States, many of these visitors wrote articles, editorials, and books. Their impressions filtered into major newspapers and magazines. Guatemala began to appear less as a small country working out its own reforms, and more as a troubled nation possibly drifting into the orbit of Moscow. Bernays also helped United Fruit craft background materials for policymakers. White papers, memoranda, and information kits explained the company's role in Central America as one of modernization and progress. Highways, schools, hospitals, the company's infrastructure projects were highlighted as evidence of benevolent investment. At the same time, the Guatemalan government's actions were described in the language that resonated most in Washington: expropriation, confiscation, radical influence, communist fellow travelers. This was not outright fabrication. There were indeed left-wing parties and figures in Guatemala, and some had ties to international movements. But the complexity of the situation was reduced to a stark binary. Reform became red, nationalism became communism. A dispute over land values became another front in the Cold War. Corporate interest and geopolitical fear braided together. In boardrooms, United Fruit executives worried about profits, contracts, and property rights. In government offices, officials worried about Soviet footholds and ideological contagion. Public relations work linked these concerns, so that protecting United Fruit's holdings could be presented as protecting the hemisphere from communism. Bernays' methods here looked familiar, but the field of play was very different. He cultivated sympathetic experts, Latin American specialists, economists, former diplomats, who were willing to speak or write from a particular angle. Some were genuinely convinced that Guatemala was sliding into dangerous territory. Others saw the world through anti-communist lenses that made almost any left-leaning policy suspect. Articles appeared in influential magazines. Congressional committees received testimony. Embassy staff read clippings compiled in neat folders. Over time, a pattern of language took hold. Infiltration, subversion, Soviet beachhead, red Guatemala. For the average American, Guatemala was distant and largely unknown. They might never have heard the name Arbenz before a headline linked it to the word communist. They might never have followed the details of Decree 900, but they understood the idea of property being taken by a left-wing government. Bernays did not control U.S. foreign policy. Decisions about coups and covert action were made in the White House. the State Department, and the CIA. But the climate in which those decisions were justified to Congress, to the press, and eventually to the public was influenced by the stories circulating in the media. In 1954, the CIA carried out Operation PBS-UKS, a covert operation that helped topple President Arbenz. Guatemalan exiles, opposition elements, and a small rebel force were supported with funds, arms, and psychological operations. Radio broadcasts spread rumors of an unstoppable rebel advance. Leaflets were dropped. Planes flew overhead. Military leaders wavered. Arbenz resigned and went into exile. Officially, this was presented as the downfall of a communist-leaning regime, a victory for freedom in the hemisphere. In the United States, many news outlets echoed this framing, already primed by years of messaging that linked Guatemalan reform with Soviet schemes. United Fruit regained security for its holdings, at least for a time. Guatemala, however, entered a long period of instability, coups, and repression. Over the following decades, the country would be torn by civil conflict and military rule. The agrarian reform was reversed. Many of those who had briefly tasted the promise of land and participation were pushed back into marginalization, and eventually into zones of violence. Looking back, the episode became one of the clearest examples of how Bernays' techniques might operate at the edge where commerce, ideology, and covert power meet. He had not lied about everything. He had not personally ordered a coup. He had framed, he selected which facts to emphasize the presence of leftists, the concern over Soviet influence, the importance of foreign investment, and which to leave in the background, the conditions of rural poverty, the legal basis of reform, the aspirations of a newly enfranchised population. He translated a business conflict into a moral drama of freedom versus communism. For him, this could be seen as an exercise in necessary leadership. For his critics, it was something more disturbing, the machinery of advertising applied to the destiny of a nation. The United Fruit affair showed that propaganda was not confined to posters and product launches. It flowed along the channels of foreign policy, investment, and security. It turned on the same levers: fear, hope, expertise, repetition. But the outcomes were not just sales figures. They were governments, lives, and histories. In the quiet language Bernays used, it was still public relations, still engineering consent. But in Guatemala, the consent of those most affected was barely consulted, and the public whose opinion was being managed lived thousands of miles away, voting in another country, imagining they were defending democracy while knowing little of the reality on the ground. After this, it became harder to maintain the gentle distinction between persuasion and manipulation. The techniques remained the same. The terrain had changed. From bananas and boardrooms, they had moved into the realm of coups and constitutions, leaving a trail that historians would later trace back to the man who believed that if you could shape symbols, you could shape society. As his career continued, Bernays would write books explaining his philosophy and defend his profession as an essential part of modern life. The public image he built for himself was careful, polished, and, like his campaigns, persuasive. But the shadow of Guatemala would linger at its edge. By the time the Guatemala campaign was underway, Bernays was not just a practitioner of persuasion. He was its theorist. He wanted to do more than run campaigns for clients. He wanted to explain and to justify what he was doing. He wanted to name the profession he was helping to create and give it an intellectual foundation. He did that in ink. In 1923, while still in his 30s, Bernays published a book called Crystallizing Public Opinion. The phrase is telling. Opinion to him was not a fixed substance. It was a cloud, a mist, a shifting mood in the minds of millions. It needed to be crystallized into something clear and definite, into support, or opposition, or indifference, depending on what the client needed. In that book, he set out what he believed public relations ought to be. He drew on the language of psychology, sociology, and mass communication. He cited crowd theorists, social scientists, and indirectly his famous uncle. He described the public not as a collection of independent thinkers, but as a group moved by habit, symbolism, and leadership. The public, in his telling, was busy, too busy to study every issue, too overwhelmed to process all the information that modern life produced. As a result, people relied on shortcuts, trusted figures, familiar brands, easy stories. Into this gap stepped the Public Relations Council, not a huckster, not a mere press agent, a counselor. He imagined this figure as something like a lawyer or a doctor for public opinion, advising clients on how to align their interests with the currents of society, and advising society on how to perceive those interests. He was, in effect, writing a job description for himself. Crystallizing Public Opinion was both a manual and a manifesto. It offered case studies, principles, and advice to anyone who wanted to practice the new craft. At the same time, it argued that this craft was essential to democracy. Without organized guidance, he suggested, public opinion would be chaotic, easily misled by demagogues, or stuck in prejudice and inertia. With proper guidance, it could be shaped toward constructive ends. Who decided what was constructive? In practice, people like Bernays. A few years later, he sharpened his argument in a book with an even more direct title, Propaganda. It appeared in 1928, just as mass advertising, radio, and national magazines were weaving a more unified culture in the United States. In that book, Bernays did something unusual. He took a word that already had sinister overtones associated with wartime lies, yellow journalism, and partisan manipulation, and tried to domesticate it. He argued that propaganda was not an aberration of modern life. It was its structure. In a complex society, he wrote, where millions of individuals could not possibly know all the facts about every question, influence had to be organized. Messages had to be selected, simplified, and sent through channels people trusted. He introduced a phrase that would echo for decades, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. That sentence in isolation sounded chilling. It still does, but in context he presented it as a neutral description of reality. Someone was always doing the manipulating, the press, the churches, political parties, advertisers. The question was not whether propaganda would exist, but whether it would be done responsibly. He went further. He wrote that those who understood the mechanisms and motives of group minds constituted an invisible government that truly ruled the country. Not in secret conspiracies, he insisted, but in the everyday guidance of thought and taste. He did not present this as a warning. He presented it as a fact and, in some ways, as a reassurance. The idea that elites organized consent for him was not a betrayal of democracy. It was how democracy functioned in the age of mass communication. For readers who found this unsettling, he offered a steady, calm voice. He wrote about engineering consent the way an engineer might speak about designing a bridge, technical, rational, inevitable. If you wanted a modern society to run smoothly, you needed experts to shape the flow of opinion, just as you needed experts to shape the flow of traffic. Those books did more than explain his thinking, they branded him. Bernays presented himself on the page as a reflective pioneer, someone who had looked behind the curtain of modern publicity and could explain what he saw. He quoted thinkers. He used the language of science. He framed his work as a profession with ethics, standards, and social responsibility. He chose his words carefully. He avoided calling himself a propagandist, even as he defended propaganda as a concept. He preferred public relations counsel, a phrase that sounded respectable, almost boring. Where others spoke of stunts and hype, he spoke of research, strategy, and public service. He cultivated this image in other ways. He lectured at universities. He appeared at conferences. He gave interviews in which he told stories about past campaigns, emphasizing the cleverness of the method and the beneficial outcome for the public. Profiles of him in magazines repeated certain themes. Here was the man who had helped popularize the idea of women smoking in public, but framed as liberating them. Here was the advisor whose campaigns had increased soap sales, but also supposedly encouraged cleanliness and health. Here was the expert whose techniques had been used in wartime, but who now applied them to peaceful enterprise. Each story reinforced the notion that he was not just selling products or policies. He was guiding a confused public toward choices it would have made anyway, if only it had the time and information. There was an irony at the core of this. The man who promoted soap, cigarettes, and corporate causes also promoted himself. His public image was, itself, a campaign. He was both the architect and the product. He wrote books that argued for the necessity of public relations, and those books served as public relations for their author. He understood that elites, business leaders, politicians, editors were among his key audiences. His book spoke directly to them, reassuring them that their desire to influence opinion could be clothed in professional language, scientific references, and talk of the common good. Crystallizing public opinion and propaganda were, in this sense, invitations. Come, they said, learn how to work with the hidden levers of perception. Come, see persuasion not as a dark art, but as an inevitable specialization in a complex world. Students, advertisers, political strategists, and corporate officials read those books. Some took them as blueprints, others as confirmation of practices they already half understood. The vocabulary of public relations, counsel, and engineering consent spread outward. His methods, once scattered in campaigns and memos, now had a theoretical home that could be taught. Over time, the profession organized itself. Trade journals appeared. University courses were developed. Professional associations set codes of ethics. Many of these developments drew directly or indirectly on Bernays' writings, even when they softened his more blunt statements. His ideas seeped into a wider culture of persuasion. Copywriters and political consultants, advertising agencies and government information offices found in his books both techniques and an ideology, the belief that steering the public was not just possible, but normal. To some, this was progress. To others, especially in later decades, it looked like something else, a handbook for managing democracy from behind a scrim of expertise and messaging. Bernays, for most of his life, was comfortable with the role. He lived to be over 100. In interviews late in his life, he spoke of his work with a tone of satisfaction, occasionally regretful about a particular client or campaign, but firm in his belief that modern society required what he had helped to build. His books remained in print. Students still read the cool, measured sentences about invisible governments and engineered consent. The words sounded almost gentle. The implications were not. They described a world in which persuasion was no longer an occasional intrusion, but a constant atmosphere, a fog in which public opinion took shape, crystallizing around ideas that had been carefully prepared long before most people heard of them. Bernays did not work in a vacuum. From the beginning, people reacted to his ideas and his campaigns, even if they did not always know his name. Some admired him, some feared what he represented. Many only later realized how deeply his approach had seeped into the culture that surrounded them. He felt that tension throughout his life. He enjoyed being called the father of public relations. He accepted awards, gave speeches, and commented, with a kind of mild amusement, on the power of the tools he had refined. At the same time, he bristled when people used a harsher word. Propagandist. He thought that term belonged to dictators, crude demagogues, and wartime ministries. He preferred the gentler language of counsel and education. Not everyone agreed. Among business leaders and politicians in the 1920s and 1930s, Bernays had ardent admirers. They saw in him something like a strategist of the subconscious. Here was someone who could take a product that people did not think they needed, or a policy they did not fully understand, and make it feel natural, even necessary. They praised his ability to read the public and create trends. They hired him to manage crises, polish reputations, and soften resistance. To them, his talk of engineering consent sounded less like manipulation and more like efficiency. If you believed that your cause was justified, why not use every available tool to present it in the most persuasive light? Within the young field of public relations, he was treated as a pioneer. Students studied his case histories the way law students studied famous trials. Practitioners quoted his phrases. His office became a kind of informal school, sending out assistants who carried his methods into agencies, corporations, and government offices. The admiration was not only practical. Some intellectuals and social reformers, especially in the aftermath of World War I, found his arguments about organized persuasion persuasive. They had seen how rumor, prejudice, and mob emotion could sweep through a society. They feared demagogues and mass hysteria. They also knew that complex reforms, public health campaigns, social insurance, international cooperation were hard to explain in a headline. To them, A disciplined approach to guiding opinion seemed like a necessary counterweight. They hoped that experts, armed with psychology and communication skills, could help steer the public away from destructive passions and toward rational, constructive policies. Bernays presented himself as one of those experts. He liked that role, but even in his own time, there were doubts. Journalists who valued independent inquiry looked at his staged events, front groups, and carefully managed spontaneous enthusiasm and felt uneasy. Was this still information, or had it become theater, with the public cast as an audience that did not know it was watching a play? Some critics pointed out that Bernays' campaigns often masked the interests behind them. When doctors recommended heavier breakfasts, how many readers knew that a bacon company had paid for the survey and the publicity? When torches of freedom marched down a street, how many women knew that a cigarette manufacturer had paid for the slogans and the photographers? To these observers, the problem was not simply that Bernays helped sell products. It was that he blurred the line between genuine public sentiment and manufactured consent. That blurring became harder to ignore after the 1930s. In Europe, totalitarian regimes perfected their own forms of propaganda. They used mass rallies, radio, film, and carefully crafted myths to mobilize populations for war, conquest, and genocide. They spoke openly of molding the minds of the people, of creating a new man, of fusing individual identity into the will of the state. Across the Atlantic, American intellectuals could not help noticing a family resemblance. The techniques were not identical, but the principles felt familiar. Repetition, symbolism, emotional appeals, the careful selection of facts, the use of trusted figures to deliver messages. Bernays himself sometimes commented on these parallels. He argued that his methods could be used for good or ill, that the tools were neutral, that the ethical burden lay with the client and the practitioner. He emphasized that he worked in a democracy, with a free press and competing voices, not under a one-party dictatorship. Yet the overlap was unsettling. Here was a man who had helped to develop peacetime campaigns for soap and cigarettes and, at the same time, had written calmly of the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. In another context, the same sentence could have appeared in a handbook for an authoritarian Ministry of Information. That discomfort grew in the post-war period. As consumer culture expanded, critics began to see public relations and advertising not just as tools for specific campaigns, but as an atmosphere. They argued that the constant pressure to buy, upgrade, and desire corroded other values. Citizens in this view were slowly being retrained to think of themselves primarily as consumers. Bernays' emphasis on tapping into unconscious desires, on linking products to deeper needs for status, security, and belonging, seemed to many observers like a manual for this transformation. If you could attach a cigarette to the idea of freedom, or a car to the idea of masculinity, or a breakfast food to the idea of family love, what else could you attach to what? Later writers, looking back on the 20th century, connected Bernays' approach to a broader pattern. They saw a system in which powerful institutions, corporations, governments, think tanks invested heavily in shaping perception before debates even began. Public relations did not just respond to public opinion, it helped define the questions, the language, and the limits of what could be imagined. In that system, formal political rights remained intact. People could vote, they could speak, they could criticize, but beneath the visible surface, a quieter process was at work, pre-selecting the menu of options, framing issues in terms that favored certain outcomes, and saturating daily life with messages that kept attention focused on consumption and private satisfaction. Bernays did not design that entire system, but he supplied tools, vocabulary, and perhaps most importantly, a justification. He wrote that in a complex society, some form of invisible guidance was inevitable and, if done responsibly, desirable. His critics asked a simple question: responsible to whom? To the client who paid the bill, to the public, whose preferences were being nudged and steered, to some higher conception of the common good, which no one had clearly defined. The gap between his calm language and the scale of the consequences became clearer as decades passed. The United Fruit campaign in Guatemala, which he later tried to distance himself from, became a case study in how corporate public relations could help prepare the ground for foreign intervention. Health campaigns funded by companies blurred the line between education and sales. Political marketing borrowed more and more from commercial advertising, with consultants testing slogans, images, and emotional triggers long before voters saw them. The unintended consequences accumulated quietly. Once psychological influence became normal, it was hard to remember a time when it had not been. Children grew up in a world where research-based messaging surrounded them from morning cereal to evening news. Adults made choices inside a landscape that had been carefully designed by specialists who understood how attention and desire worked. In that landscape, sincerity and strategy coexisted. Genuine beliefs were expressed using techniques once reserved for selling soap. Social movements hired public relations firms. Governments ran information campaigns that looked very much like advertising. Corporations spoke the language of social responsibility while funding studies and front groups to protect their interests. The boundaries between democratic persuasion and something more manipulative became hazy. Bernays, in his long life, saw some of this. In interviews, he occasionally expressed regret about particular uses of public relations, especially when clients misled him or hid their full intentions. But he remained largely confident in the profession he had helped create. He continued to argue that in a world of mass media, organized persuasion was not a choice. It was a condition. His admirers agreed, seeing in him a visionary who had simply recognized the realities of modern life and built a profession to manage them. His critics saw something more troubling. A man who had helped to wrap elite influence in the language of expertise and public service, and in doing so, had made it harder to see where genuine consent ended and manufactured consent began. Between those two views lay the world most of us inhabit. A world shaped in ways both visible and hidden by techniques that were once experiments on crowds and have since become routine. The story of Edward Bernays is, in that sense, not just about one strategist. It is about a set of tools that slipped their original bounds, spread through institutions, and changed how modern societies talk to themselves, and how we, living inside that fog of messages, come to feel that our desires are our own. By the time Bernays was an old man, the world he had helped to imagine no longer needed him in person. His ideas had been absorbed, simplified, and woven into ordinary practice. You can trace that absorption in the most everyday places, in the way advertising agencies organize focus groups to watch people react to a new cereal box, in the way brands try to associate themselves with moods and lifestyles rather than just price and function, in the way pollsters test phrases, images, and tones of voice before a political speech is ever delivered. All of these trades, now taken for granted, advertising, branding, polling, media strategy, lean on the assumption that desire, opinion, and identity can be studied, guided, and at times engineered. That assumption was once controversial. For Bernays, it had been a revelation. For later generations, it became a starting point. Modern branding is one of the clearest examples. A brand is no longer just a name on a package. It is an organized set of associations: comfort, rebellion, authenticity, professionalism, nostalgia. Companies invest enormous resources in curating those associations. They sponsor events, choose spokespersons, adopt political and social stances, release carefully crafted apologies when things go wrong. Behind each of these moves sits a quiet, almost automatic question that Bernays would have recognized. What will this do to the mental picture people carry of us? That same logic stretches into crisis management and corporate communications. When an oil spill coats a shoreline, when a product harms consumers, when a scandal erupts inside a company, the first response is often not purely technical or legal. It is communicative. A statement is drafted, responsibility is framed, regret is expressed or avoided in calculated ways. Third-party experts are quoted. Sympathetic stories about the company's positive contributions are circulated to balance the negative coverage. This world of spin did not appear overnight. It grew piece by piece, out of practices that Bernays helped to theorize: the use of trusted intermediaries, the staging of events to create news, the careful seeding of narratives before they are needed. The same is true in politics, polling. Once a rough instrument for measuring public moods, turned into a fine tool for shaping them. Campaign consultants test not only which policies are popular, but which words make those policies feel safe, fair, or threatening. They segment voters into soccer moms, security voters, suburban independents, and dozens of other clusters, each with its own profile of fears and hopes. Platform speeches and advertisements are then tailored to fit these psychological maps. Public opinion becomes, in part, a feedback loop between messages crafted in private rooms and reactions measured in numbers and charts. Bernays would have understood that loop. He had always argued that leaders should study the public as carefully as engineers study materials, and then design communications accordingly. What he did not live to fully see was how digital technology would amplify those instincts. The arrival of the internet, social media, and ubiquitous data collection turned the broad strokes of mass persuasion into something far more granular. Instead of placing an ad in a general interest magazine and hoping it reached the right kind of reader, companies and campaigns could now speak to narrow slices of the population. Younger parents in a particular city, people who had just searched for moving companies or anxiety symptoms, fans of a certain musician, viewers who lingered over videos about self-improvement or conspiracy theories or luxury travel. Algorithms, trained on oceans of behavioral data, learned to predict what would capture attention, what would trigger a click, what would keep someone scrolling for just a little longer. Influencers, many of them ordinary individuals who had become minor celebrities in specialized online worlds, stepped into a role that Bernays had once assigned to doctors, debutantes, and public intellectuals. They presented products, causes, and lifestyles to their followers with a blend of seeming authenticity and subtle performance. A recommendation felt like a personal suggestion rather than a paid placement, even when money or gifts had changed hands. Advertising merged with social interaction. Promotion merged with identity. At first glance, this digital landscape looks like a radical departure from the world of press releases, newspaper editors, and radio commentators that Bernays knew. The technologies are different. The scale is different. Billions of individualized messages can now be sent, adjusted, and optimized in real time. But if you look beneath the surface, many of the underlying principles are familiar. The appeal to emotion rather than argument, the linking of products and policies to deep needs for belonging, recognition, and security. The use of intermediaries, whether experts, celebrities, or influencers, to carry messages more credibly than an overt advertisement. The quiet testing of responses before the public realizes it is part of an experiment. In that continuity lies the long shadow of engineered desire. What has changed is the intensity, the speed, and the intimacy of the process. Where Bernays worked at the level of broad public moods, today's systems can follow the micro-fluctuations of an individual's attention through the day. Where he relied on intuition, interviews, and occasional surveys, current practitioners draw on streams of data that record where we click, how long we pause, what we like, whom we follow. Yet something has remained constant. The basic belief that people's choices can be shaped most effectively when they do not feel shaped. That they are most persuadable when they experience a message as arising from their own interests, their own circle, their own feed. Bernays, looking forward, believed this kind of guidance to be inevitable in a complex society and potentially beneficial if guided by enlightened professionals. Looking around now, the question that troubled his critics returns in a different form. Who exactly are the professionals? To whom are they responsible? To shareholders, to clients, to platforms, to abstract metrics of engagement, or to some notion of a public whose desires and fears their work helps to cultivate? The present information environment, a mesh of advertising, entertainment, political messaging, and personal communication, did not arise solely from his designs, but he stands as a bridge between older, cruder forms of propaganda and the more sophisticated systems that surround us now. He articulated, earlier and more bluntly than most, the idea that managing perception was a profession in its own right. The people and machines that now compete for our attention operate inside that frame. In the glow of a screen scrolling through headlines, images, and invitations to buy or believe, it can be hard to hear the echoes. But they are there, in the comfort of familiar brands, in the outrage that flares and fades with each news cycle, in the quiet feeling that our preferences are spontaneous, when they have been anticipated, measured, and gently steered. In that sense, the history of Edward Bernays does not end with his retirement or his death. It extends into the habits of a culture that has grown used to being courted, studied, and nudged. A culture in which engineered desire has become part of the weather of daily life, always present, usually unnoticed, shaping the paths we take without quite declaring itself. Edward Bernays was not the only architect of this environment, but his life traces a clear line through it. He began as a young press agent in New York, looking for ways to make theater productions and stage acts seem newsworthy. He passed through the crucible of wartime propaganda, helping to sell a distant conflict as a noble cause. He borrowed language and concepts from his uncle's psychoanalytic circle and applied them, not in the consulting room, but in the marketplace and the public square. He wrapped cigarettes in the language of emancipation, breakfast food in the language of science, corporate interests in the language of democracy. Around those experiments, he built something new, a self-conscious profession devoted to managing the relationship between institutions and the public mind. By the time he was writing his later books, he spoke quite openly about engineering consent as a necessary function in modern life. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to divide that legacy neatly into good and bad, to blame him for manipulation, and to credit him for professionalizing communication. But his story does not resolve itself that easily. He believed that, in a crowded, complex society, some form of organized guidance was inevitable. People could not possibly investigate every issue, every product, every policy for themselves. They would always rely on shortcuts, on trusted voices, on symbols and stories. The real question for him was who would shape those shortcuts, and to what end? That question has not gone away. It has only multiplied. When you see a cause wrapped in compelling images, when a brand appears aligned with a sudden social movement, when a politician seems to find exactly the words that resonate with a vague unease, you're watching. In some form, the systems he helped to name. Sometimes the result is genuinely useful. Public health campaigns that reduce smoking, seatbelt injuries, or drunk driving follow many of the same principles he practiced. So do efforts to destigmatize mental illness, or to encourage people to vote. The tools of influence are not inherently sinister. They are, at base, tools for focusing attention and framing meaning. Yet influence always carries a shadow. The same techniques can obscure as easily as they can clarify. They can invite people to participate, or they can nudge them toward outcomes chosen far away from any democratic forum. They can amplify empathy, or they can inflame resentment. The moral weight lies less in the method than in the combination of intent, transparency, and power. Studying Bernays does not give a simple rule for sorting right from wrong. What it offers instead is a lens. It invites a habit of asking, gently and persistently, a few questions when we encounter appeals to our feelings and our loyalties. Who benefits if I believe this? Whose language am I adopting when I repeat this phrase? What emotions are being stirred, and what actions are they pointing me toward? Those questions do not require cynicism. They simply introduce a small pause between stimulus and response. A moment of awareness inside the stream of suggestions that reach us each day. In that pause, the long shadow of Bernays' work becomes a little more visible. Not as a single mastermind controlling events, but as a set of assumptions and practices that still guide how messages are made and delivered. The assumption that opinion can be studied and steered. The practice of working through intermediaries and symbols. The belief that managing perception is as real a form of power as controlling territory or money. For a history told at the edge of sleep, this may sound like an unsettling place to end, but there is a quieter way to hold it. The forces that shape collective belief are not all powerful. They are strong, but they are also constrained by attention, by culture, by unexpected events, by the stubborn complexity of human beings. Knowing they exist does not remove their influence, but it makes that influence less invisible. Tonight, as you lie with these stories in the background of your thoughts, you're already doing the thing that most unsettled Bernays' critics and most interested him as a practitioner. You are reflecting on how your own opinions are formed, on the subtle ways that headlines, images, and experts arrange themselves in your mind. That reflection is its own small counterweight. Edward Bernays has been gone for many years. The systems he worked on hum quietly around us. Understanding his role in building them will not stop the stream of persuasion, but it can make that stream feel, if not fully under our control, at least a little more familiar. A pattern we can recognize, a history we can see, and then slowly drift away from, as the night deepens and the noise of the public world recedes into something softer, farther, and easier to set aside.